I want to start with a feeling rather than a framework today. There's a specific kind of vertigo that has nothing to do with height. You know the one. Ground gives way underneath you, and you weren't expecting it, and it takes you a while to even understand what happened.
The floor that wasn't a floor. This sounds like a great episode ahead. So hi everyone, welcome to Braver Leadership with myself, Alex. And Braver Leadership Coaching, Ian. Let's keep going with that story.
The story that took me there this week was a client I've written about before. I've called her Amanda, not her real name. Genuinely talented. Someone with real authority eventually noticed that. A sponsor who saw the leader underneath the role she'd been cast into for years and gave her room the organisation hadn't previously thought to offer her.
And for a while that worked.
For a while the sunshine came out. She was visible, she was trusted, she was given the kind of latitude that tells you an organisation actually rates you. Then the sponsor moved on, promoted elsewhere, out of the building, and Amanda was back in the pack.
Which sounds almost too clean as a turning point. Sponsor leaves, things go quiet. Is it really that direct a line?
It rarely comes out as directly as that, no. Nobody tells you your standing just dropped. What happens is subtler. The meetings you used to be pulled into stop happening. The benefit of the doubt you used to get evaporates. And the thing is, nothing about Amanda's capability had changed in that window. She was exactly as good at her job the week after the sponsor left as the week before.
So what had actually changed?
The ground she'd been standing on had never been hers. It had been laid by someone else's attention. When that attention moved, the ground moved with it.
I want to sit with that phrase for a second, because I think most people listening will have a version of this and not have named it yet. Borrowed ground.
That's the name I've landed on for it, yes. And I think naming it precisely matters more than people assume. Because if you don't have language for this, you default to the nearest explanation available, which is almost always the wrong one.
Which is what? That you've lost your edge.
Right? Or that you were never really that good, the sponsor was just being kind. Or that something about you personally has become less valuable. All three of those are wrong. And all three of those are what people quietly conclude when the ground moves, and they don't have a better explanation on hand.
So let's build the better explanation. What is borrowed ground exactly, in the plainest terms you've got?
It's confidence and belonging that depend entirely on one relationship, one sponsor, one structure, continuing to hold. Nothing underneath it belongs to you independently. It works beautifully right up until the moment it doesn't. And the moment it doesn't is entirely outside your control.
Which is the part that feels unfair about it. You didn't do anything wrong.
You didn't. And I want to be really clear about that, because there's a version of this conversation that sounds like I'm blaming Amanda for building on ground that wasn't hers. That's not it at all. Almost every leader builds early ground exactly this way, because it's the only ground available to you early on. Someone spots you. A role gets shaped around what you're good at. An organisation decides, for a period, that you matter in a particular way. You didn't choose that dishonestly. You stood where you were put, and you stood there well.
So when does it become a problem?
It becomes a problem the moment the hand that laid the ground moves. And here's the thing, it always moves eventually. Sponsors get promoted, or they leave, or their own priorities shift. Reorganisations happen. The thing that made you visible stops being the thing anyone's looking for that quarter. At that point, the leaders who only ever had borrowed ground discover there's nothing underneath it.
Not because they lack capability?
Usually the opposite is true. It's because nobody, including them, ever built anything that didn't depend on someone else's continued attention.
I think this is where it gets genuinely useful rather than just uncomfortable. Because the natural instinct when this happens is to go find a new sponsor. Fix the problem by rebuilding the same structure with a different landlord.
Which works, sort of, for a while. And then the exact same thing happens again in 3 years, 5 years, whenever that sponsor also moves. You haven't solved anything, you've just delayed the next collapse.
So what's the actual answer? If it isn't finding better ground to borrow?
The actual answer is building ground that's yours. And I want to define that precisely because it's easy for this to drift into something vague and unhelpful. Solid ground isn't a promotion, it isn't a sponsor, it isn't a title. It's a settled, examined sense of what you value and what you're actually for, that exists independently of who's currently watching.
That sounds abstract, until you actually need it.
It is abstract until the day it's the only thing that matters. And what I've noticed with the leaders who come through a borrowed ground collapse well is they treat the collapse as the question it actually is. Not why did they stop seeing me? That's the wrong question, and it keeps you oriented around the sponsor rather than yourself. The right question is, who am I when nobody in particular is looking?
That's not a comfortable question to sit with.
No, it's rarely asked voluntarily, which is exactly why the collapse ends up being useful, even though nobody would choose it. It forces a question most leaders would otherwise avoid indefinitely.
Practically then, if someone listening recognizes this in themselves right now, mid-collapse, ground moving under their feet, what do they actually do this week?
The instinct to resist is to go find the next sponsor faster or to perform more visibly for whoever happens to be in the room right now. I'd say don't. That just rebuilds the same borrowed structure. It doesn't fix anything.
So instead, do what?
Instead, get specific. Not vaguely reflective, actually specific, about what you value and what you believe good leadership looks like, independent of any single relationship, and then act from that, deliberately, in the ordinary decisions nobody's watching. The unglamorous Tuesday afternoon calls, where there's no sponsor in the room to notice either way.
Because those are the decisions that actually build the ground.
Those are exactly the decisions that build the ground. Not the visible ones, the invisible ones. It's slow, and it doesn't feel like progress most days. But it's the only version of ground that's genuinely yours, and it's the only version that doesn't move the next time someone gets promoted, or leaves, or reorganises the chart.
I want to push on something, because we've spent this whole conversation inside Amanda's experience of it, which is right. That's where it starts. But there's a second half to this that I don't think gets said enough. How does borrowed ground actually look from outside? What does the organisation see?
This is the part leaders in this position almost never get told directly, and it's worth being honest about. From the outside, a leader on borrowed ground doesn't read as unlucky. They read as inconsistent.
Because the confidence was never evenly distributed to begin with.
Right? Colleagues remember the version of you that was sharp, decisive, visible, because that was genuinely who you were with the ground underneath you. Then the ground moves, and the same person seems more hesitant, checks in more, takes fewer risks. Nobody in the room knows why. They just see a capability dip, and capability dips get filed as performance concerns, whether or not that's remotely fair.
Which is a brutal irony, because the underlying capability hasn't moved at all.
Not even slightly. But perception doesn't wait for the accurate explanation, it fills the gap with the nearest available story. And the nearest available story, from outside, is almost never borrowed ground. It's usually something closer to they've plateaued, or the promotion was premature, or they were never quite ready for this level. All of which is wrong, and all of which sticks if it isn't corrected quickly.
So there's a real cost to staying quiet about this internally.
A real cost, and it compounds. The longer a leader sits in the collapse without naming what's actually happening, the more the external read hardens into a fixed judgment about them, which is exactly why naming it matters practically, not just emotionally. If you can say clearly to a trusted manager or mentor, I've noticed my confidence has tracked one relationship more than I'd like it to, and I'm rebuilding that. You change the story being told about you before it calcifies into something harder to shift.
That's a genuinely useful reframe of what naming does. It's not just self-soothing, it's active management of how you're being read.
Exactly that. And it cuts both ways, because it's also useful for anyone listening who happens to be on the other side of this. Someone managing a leader who used to be sharp and has gone quiet since a sponsor left or a reorg landed. The instinct is to quietly deprioritise them, usually the wrong call. What's missing isn't capability, it's ground of their own, and that's fixable with the right kind of attention.
What does the right kind of attention actually look like, from a manager's side of that?
It's rarely a big intervention, it's noticing the pattern rather than the symptom. If someone's confidence has visibly narrowed since a specific departure or change, the useful move isn't to just wait for them to bounce back or quietly write them off. It's a direct, kind conversation. Something as simple as, "I've noticed you're more cautious than you were 6 months ago. Is that something you're aware of?" That single question often does more than any formal development plan, because it gives the leader permission to name what's happening rather than privately wondering if they've imagined it.
Which brings us back to Amanda, because I don't think we've said what actually changed for her.
What changed wasn't a new sponsor. It was Amanda getting specific, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, about what she actually believed good leadership looked like, independent of who was in the room watching her do it. She started making decisions from that rather than from what she thought would be noticed. And the strange thing is, she became more visible again, not because she was chasing visibility, but because a leader who's operating from something settled reads differently to people around them, whether or not anyone's actively sponsoring it.
So the visibility came back as a byproduct, not the goal.
Exactly the wrong order to chase deliberately, and exactly the right order to end up in.
If you had to leave one thing with someone listening who's realised partway through this conversation that they're standing on borrowed ground right now,
I'd say the vertigo you're feeling isn't a verdict on you, internally or externally. It's information. It's telling you precisely where the ground was never yours to begin with, which means it's also telling you exactly where to start building. That's not nothing. That's actually a fairly precise map, if you're willing to read it as one, and it's worth saying out loud to someone before the silence does the talking for you.
borrowed ground giving way isn't the end of the story. It's the point where the real one starts.
That's it exactly.
And that is where we're going to leave things for this episode. Remember, as always, if we've on something meaningful for you, details of how to work with Ian are in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on Braver Leadership. And if you're listening to this as a business owner or HR leader, check out our sister show, The Leadership Brief, where Ian and Joe look at this topic from a leadership angle. You can catch all our episodes by subscribing and liking this podcast wherever you get it from.